Hello, my name is Elizabeth Stanway, and I'm an astronomer who enjoys reading and watching science fiction. In my Cosmic Stories blog, I explore the connections between the two, looking at how science is represented in science fiction and at the way fiction can reflect the understanding of contemporary science by society as a whole. In this video, we're going to take a journey backwards through time to look at how the Jodrell Bank Radio Observatory has appeared in science fiction as an icon of scientific excellence. The Lovell Radio Telescope at Jodrell Bank Observatory in Cheshire, with its 76-metre dish, is still one of the largest fully steerable telescopes in the world. Originally referred to as the 250-foot telescope, or just as the Jodrell Bank Telescope, it was renamed in 1988 in honour of Sir Bernard Lovell, who founded the observatory in 1955. The telescope saw first light in 1957, and, despite spiralling costs and huge technical difficulties, was quickly recognised as an icon of both cutting-edge technological innovation and British aspirations to scientific leadership. This image was cemented in the collective imaginary of the British public when it was successfully used to track signals from the very first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, just a few months after the radio telescope first came into operation, and again when it proved to be the only station capable of tracking the Russian lunar missions to the moon. The Jodrell Bank Observatory is still actively used for scientific research, operated by the University of Manchester, and hosts the headquarters for the upcoming Square Kilometre Array. The site also hosts an extensive and active science communication centre, and its importance has been recognised since 2019 by the status of a UNESCO World Heritage Site. While astronomers use the Lovell telescope to study light emitted in the distant past, the observatory's iconic status means that we can also look at the interaction between this science facility and science fiction, both in the representations of science in the recent past and in imagery of the future. Perhaps the best known appearance of Jodrell Bank in science fiction occurs in the television series Doctor Who, when Tom Baker's Fourth Doctor and the Master compete over the facility's use to prevent the destruction of the universe. While the science here is problematic in places, it nonetheless invokes the terminology of radio astronomy to lend authority, including references to 3C461, the Cassiopeia A supernova remnant, as catalogued in the third Cambridge Catalogue of Radio Sources. Tom Baker's Doctor ultimately falls to his regeneration from the walkways of the Lovell telescope, described in the script as the Pharos Project, and emerges from the experience in the form of Peter Davison's Fifth Doctor. This event, coming at the climax of the story Logopolis in 1981, was notable for using a telescope already over 2 decades old as a visual shorthand for excitingly advanced technology. If this was still the case in 1981, then how was the telescope perceived in earlier decades? Well, we can gain additional insights into this without leaving the Doctor Who universe. Annuals for the series were published in the UK every year from 1965 to 1985. These combined factual articles with prose stories, in-universe reference material, picture strip stories, games and activities. The factual articles were often, but not always, themed on space or other technological innovations. The Doctor Who Annual 1981, published the year before the Lovell telescope appeared on screen in Logopolis, contained a full-page article entitled Scanning the Skies. Interestingly, for a book aimed at a young audience, this explained several aspects of the detailed work done at Jodrell Bank, with a focus on the then current theories proposed to explain the origins of quasars. These included matter, antimatter annihilation, and black holes formed by direct gravitational collapse. The latter of these explanations was already in the ascendant in the scientific community at this point, although questions remained. Perhaps most interesting is the opening line of the article. You shouldn't have any difficulty recognizing the enormous radio telescope in our picture. More than 20 years after its construction, the telescope was still a familiar image in the media, expected to be familiar to children. Stepping back in time, we encounter Jodrell Bank again in the 1974 Doctor Who Summer Holiday Special, a magazine equivalent of the usual Christmas annuals. Here, the reference is entirely a visual one. John Pertwee's third Doctor and his companion Sarah Jane need to observe a poison gas cloud that is about to kill all life on Earth. We'll pass over the astrophysics of that rapidly for now. The giant electronic eye they use is never named, but is nonetheless unmistakably modelled on the Lovell telescope. In the previous decade, the Doctor Who annual 1969 included a double-page factual article entitled Listen to the Stars, perhaps reflecting the intense interest in the details of space science at this key point in the space age. The article is heavily technical. Giving a brief history of radio astronomy, it then goes on to describe the Lovell telescope dish and its capabilities, control systems, and structural details, including the challenge of dealing with rain accumulation and high winds. Its work is described as including meteor tracking and radio ranging experiments, as well as study of extragalactic radio sources. Again, though, it's interesting to note the way in which the annual frames this technical account. In this case, rather than the opening sentence, we can look at the final comments. It says, Jodrell Bank is now world famous. Its success in tracking the Russian Sputniks and the American space probes won it distinction in the International Geophysical Year. Britain has entered the space age exploration as an active participant thanks to this amazing radio telescope. What interests me is the way this frames Britain's technical aspirations. At the time of writing, the telescope would have been just a decade old, and the space race at its height, with the first moon landing to follow in the following year. Earlier fiction tended to position Britain as a future leader in space travel. Cultural historian and geographer Oliver Dunnett has argued that there was a distinctively British outer space in the 1950s and 60s, which developed largely from the aspirations of the British Interplanetary Society and spread into the wider cultural milieu through the work of its members, including science populariser Patrick Moore, science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke, and others. In this vision of the future, the focus was very much on crewed spaceflight. For the BIS, astronomy was certainly not sufficient to fulfil British potential or qualify as space age exploration. However, here, in an aspirational annual aimed at children, we see a little more realism, with an attempt instead to reframe space travel as space exploration in the astronomical sense, and that pursuit being equated in some sense with the exploits of the Russo-American space race. If, by the end of the 1960s, Jodrell Bank was being used to justify Britain's relatively minor contribution to the new era of space exploration, how was it represented in its first decade? The observatory's founder, Bernard Lovell, inspired the first name of television scientist Bernard Quatermass in Nigel Kneale's Quatermass science fiction dramas for the BBC in the early 1950s. He also influenced Fred Hoyle's depiction of radio astronomers in the early science fiction television drama A for Andromeda. But it wasn't really until the 250-foot telescope, eventually to be named after him, was constructed that a striking image was added to the science fiction imaginary of the late 1950s and 60s. The familiar outline of the telescope appears in comics of this era, including Dr. Solar, Man of the Atom, where Kendal Banks, England, home of the world's largest radio telescope, is a key location, and Strange Adventures, where giant aliens make an invasion via radio telescope, climbing out from a very familiar-looking dish. In each case, the dish is used to represent the pinnacle of human technical achievement and to contrast this against alien interventions. Both of these comics were published by American companies, showing the widespread use of this image and the attraction it had for young readers all over the world at the time. Back in Britain, one of the most popular science fictions for young people at this time was provided by Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future, the lead comic strip in the Eagle comic. The Dan Dare stories of this date had strayed outside our own solar system and no longer prioritised the rigorous attention to technical detail seen in its earlier years. Nonetheless, the interest of its audience in space science was still profound. Dan Dare's Space Annual, 1963, contained several pages of descriptions of landmarks in the history of telescopes, including a full-page illustration of the Lovell telescope and its control room. While this is less detailed than the articles in the Doctor Who annuals, it highlights the tracking of Pioneer 5, again associating Jodrell Bank with the American space program. A more detailed insight was provided to the same readers, and at about the same time, in a full-page article called The Man from Eagle, which described a personal visit to Jodrell Bank. Alongside technical information on the dish and its capabilities, a description is given of the facility's space tracking work and science highlights. These included lunar ranging of Venus and identification of radio emission from a galaxy merger, as well as making the observation that Sir Bernard's staff were acquainted with the doings of Dan Dare and seemed just as interested in Eagle as I was in Jodrell Bank. Again, the final words of the article are telling. From what I saw at Jodrell Bank, I am quite sure that future generations will regard its work as amongst the greatest contributions towards man's knowledge of the universe and what lies beyond. These are just a handful of the many representations of Jodrell Bank in science fiction stories. But as we've seen, the excitement over the dish was long-lasting, although its initial optimism gradually faded. Jodrell Bank has become simultaneously an icon of aspirations of British space in the post-war period, and an emblem of the failure of a crude British space programme. In 2004, a new comic, Ministry of Space, by Ellis, Weston and Martin, presented a Dan Dare-inspired alternate history in which Britain fulfilled its post-war aspirations to international leadership and to space-age dominance. In contrast to the 1950s Dan Dare, though, This was a far more cynical view, with darkness and political immorality lying at its heart. Amongst its early scenes, there is a sequence explicitly set at Jodrell Bank showing the Lovell telescope. Dated 1948, well before the telescope was constructed, it uses the powerful iconography of the telescope to recapture that age of British aspiration while pulling it forward in time to highlight the rapid pace of development in this alternate history, where financial constraints were unimportant. This use of Jodrell Bank is not accidental. In an afterword, the comic's creator, Warren Ellis, comments that the construction of the Jodrell Bank radio telescope put a chunk of the future in Middle England. You got the palpable sense that Britain wanted to believe that there was something next. So has the Man from Eagle's prediction come true? Does the future, now current generation, regard its work as amongst the greatest contribution towards man's knowledge? Astronomers are certainly still well aware of the telescope and its work, although it has been complemented and somewhat superseded by other large dishes and radio telescope arrays. Amongst elder members of the general public, the children of the 1950s, 60s and 70s, the Lovell telescope's iconic status was confirmed in 2008 when a general outcry met proposals for its closure due to budget cuts. The facility was reprieved after political intervention. However, the younger generation, particularly those who have never visited its Discovery Centre, are likely less familiar with its image than those who grew up with Jodrell Bank's work making headlines. Despite this, Jodrell Bank is visited by 150,000 or more people annually, and its school workshop programme reaches thousands of students. In this science, education and astronomical context, Jodrell Bank's role as an icon of British space aspirations remains striking. In recent years, the observatory has hosted the Blue Dot Festival, which aims to combine music with science and culture. And in 2015, the BBC produced an episode of the documentary series Time Shift, entitled How Britain Won the Space Range, telling the history of Jodrell Bank and Bernard Lovell. This is certainly a title that the readers of science fiction past would be unsurprised to encounter, but its impact now lies in the surprise it will evoke when encountered by a modern audience. The title itself is a reminder of the flexibility of the observatory's presence in the British imaginary of space and the varied ways which it has been interpreted over time. I hope you've enjoyed this video, which was based on an entry in my Cosmic Stories blog from 2021. You can find links to some of the sources and more detail on the blog website linked in the video description. I also have a separate entry on radio telescopes called Our Ears on the Sky, and a constantly growing list of other appearances of Jodrell Bank in science fiction, which I'm pleased to add to and which you might find interesting. I post new text entries on the blog every 2 weeks, and I'm always happy to receive comments, either on those entries or on these videos. Thank you for watching.